Hi everybody, welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower, like it is every week. Is it ever gonna change? I don't know. Anyway, hi, welcome to another Storytime with Sid. So this episode is a continuation of a previous episode, and if you haven't watched that, I would suggest going to see the Snow Queen Part 1, because this is the Snow Queen Part 2. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get that out of the way. On another note, I wanted to also address something in the last video where I talked about how the mortal realm is going through a really big change right now. I have seen so much kindness over the past week. I've seen so much hurt also over the past week, but I think the most important thing is that people are listening, people are talking, and that's fantastic. People are moving forward in a positive direction, and I think that there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done, but I think it is also worth acknowledging the fact that people are coming together for what they believe in and raising their voices, and it's beautiful and it's wonderful. And thank you, whoever exists in the sky or in the ground or in the trees or in the breeze, thank you for bringing mortals together so we can help them move forward, because it's important. So, today I wanted to continue on the very, very important story of the Snow Queen, because the Snow Queen has a really lot of interesting stuff in there, and I'm excited to see what happens. Now, if you want a small recap, the little girl Gerda was off to find her friend Kai, and she has just left the witch's, I guess you would call it a hut, her home. Just left the witch's home to go find Kai, who was stolen by the Snow Queen. Here we go. The fourth story, The Prince and the Princess. Gerda had to rest again. Then right across from where she was sitting, a big crow landed in the snow. He had been sitting and watching her for a long time, wagging his head. Now he said, "Caw, caw, caw, go da, go da." He didn't say good day any better than that, but he meant the little girl well and asked her where she was going, all alone out in the wide world. The word alone was something that Gerda understood quite well, and had felt that it meant firsthand. So she told the crow all about her life and asked him whether he had seen Kai. The crow nodded rather thoughtfully and said, that could be. What, have you really?" cried the little girl, and practically crushed the crow to death as she kissed him so hard. Be sensible, said the crow. I think I know. I think it might be little Kai, but now he seems to have forgotten you in favor of the princess." "Does he live with a princess?" asked Gerda. "Just listen," said the crow. "But it's hard for me to speak your language. If you understand crow speak, I can explain things much better." "No, I never learned it," said Gerda. "But grandmother can speak it, and she knows pea talk too. If only I had learned it." "It doesn't matter," said the crow. "I'll try to tell you the best I can, but I'm still going to do a poor job of it." And then he told her all he knew. "In the kingdom for where we now find ourselves, there lives a princess who is terribly clever. She has read all the newspapers that exist in the world and forgotten them again. That's how clever she is. The other day she was sitting on the throne. They say that's not especially amusing, and she happened to hum a song, the one that goes, 'Why shouldn't I marry?' You know, there's something to that," she said, and then she decided to get married. But she wants a husband who knows how to respond when spoken to, someone who won't just stand there looking elegant, because that's much too boring. So she gathered all her ladies in waiting, and when they heard what she had in mind, they were quite pleased. "We like that," they said. "We were thinking about the very thing the other day. You can trust me, every word I say is true," said the crow. "I have a tame sweetheart who is allowed to move freely through the palace, and she has told me everything." Of course, his sweetheart was also a crow, for crows seek their equals, and they're always crows. "The newspapers were printed at once with a border of hearts and the monogram of the princess. There you could read that any good-looking young man was welcome to come to the palace and speak with the princess. The one who spoke it was so clear that he felt at home. The man who spoke the best was the one the princess would take as her husband." "Oh, yes," said the crow. "You can believe what I tell you. It's true as I'm sitting here. Men came swarming. There was a great hubbub and commotion, but with no success, either on the first day or the second. They could all speak well when they were out in the street, but as soon as they entered the palace gates and saw the royal guards dressed in silver, and the footmen dressed in gold standing along the stairs, and the great illuminated halls, they were all struck dumb. And they stood in front of the throne where the princess sat. They couldn't think of anything to say except the last words she had uttered, and she didn't care to hear herself repeated. It was as if the men's bellies had been filled with the snuff inside the palace, as if they fell into a daze until they came back out to the street. Then they had no trouble talking. A line stretched from the city gates all the way to the palace. "I went to see it myself," said the crow. They grew hungry and thirsty, but from the palace they received not so much as a glass of lukewarm water. Some of the cleverest did bring sandwiches along, but they refused to share with their neighbor. They thought, "Let him go hungry, the princess won't choose him." "But what about Kai? Little Kai?" asked Gerda. "When did he arrive? Was he there in the crowd?" Give me time, I'm just getting to him." It was on the third day that the little man arrived, without a horse or carriage, and marched quite boldly up to the palace. His eyes shone like yours. He had lovely long hair, but his clothes were in tatters. "That was Kai!" Gerda rejoiced. "Oh, at last I found him!" And she clapped her hands. "He had a little knapsack on his back," said the crow. No, that must have been his sled," said Gerda, "because he left with his sled." "That could be," said the crow. "I didn't look very closely, but I knew from my tame sweetheart that when he went through the palace gates and saw the royal guards dressed in silver and the footmen dressed in gold standing along the stairs, he wasn't the least bit daunted. He nodded and said to them, 'It must be boring to stand on the stairs. I'd much rather go inside.' There the halls were ablaze with light. There the privy councillors and excellencies walked around barefoot, carrying gold platters. It was enough to intimidate anyone. The creaking of his boots was terribly loud, and yet he wasn't afraid." "It must have been Kai," said Gerda. "I know that he had new boots. I've heard them creak in grandmother's parlor." "And creak they did," said the crow. He boldly walked right up to the princess, who was sitting on a pearl as big as a spinning wheel. Grouped all around were the ladies in waiting, and with their maids and the maids of their maids, and all the chamberlains with their servants, and the servants of their servants, who all have pages, and the closer they stood to the door, the more haughty they looked. The page of the servants' servants, who always wears slippers, was almost unbearable to look at, so haughty did he seem, standing in the doorway. "That must have been terrible," said little Gerda. "And yet Kai won the princess?" "If I weren't a crow, I would have won her myself, even though I'm engaged. He supposedly spoke as well as I do when I speak crow speak. That's what my tame sweetheart told me. He was bold and charming. He hadn't come as a suitor, but simply to listen to the wisdom of the princess, which he found to his liking. And she sure found him to her liking." "I'm sure of it. That was Kai," said Gerda. "He was so clever. He could do his figures in his head even with fractions. Oh, won't you please take me to the palace?" "Well, that's easy enough for you to say," said the crow. "How are we going to do that?" "I'll have to talk to my tame sweetheart about it. Surely she can advise us, because I must tell you that a little girl like you will never be granted permission to enter in the usual manner." "Oh, yes, I will," said Gerda. "When Kai finds out that I'm here, he'll come out at once to get me." "Wait for me by that stile over there," said the crow, as he wagged his head off and flew off. It was dark before the crow came back. "Caw-caw," he said. "I bring you many greetings from my sweetheart. And here's a scrap of bread for you." She took it from the kitchen. "There's plenty of bread, and you must be hungry. It's not possible for you to enter the palace. You're barefoot, after all. The guards dressed in silver and the footmen dressed in gold would never permit it. But don't cry. We'll find a way to get you in. My sweetheart knows of a little back stairway that leads to the bedchamber, and she knows where to find the key." So they went to the garden along the great promenade, where one leaf fell after another. And when the lights in the palace were put out, one after another, the crow led little Gerda over to the back door that stood ajar. Oh, how Gerda's heart was pounding with fear and longing. She felt as if she were about to do something wrong, but all she wanted was to find out whether it was little Kai. Oh yes, it had to be him. She could so vividly see his clever eyes, his long hair. She could see so clearly the way he smiled when they sat under the roses back home. Surely he would be glad to see her, to hear what a long way she had come for his sake, to know how sad they all were at home when he didn't come back. Oh, she felt both fear and joy. Then they sat on the stairs. A little lamp was burning atop a cupboard. In the middle of the room stood a tame crow, turning her head to all sides looking at Gerda, who curtsies as her grandmother had taught her. "My fiancé has spoken so highly of you, my dear," said the tame crow. "Your life story, your Vita, as it's called, is almost touching. If you take the lamp, I will lead the way. We're taking the direct route because we won't meet anyone." "I think someone is coming right behind us," said Gerda, as something rushed past her. The shadows on the walls looked like horses with flowing manes and slender legs. Hunter boys and gentlemen and ladies on horseback. "Those are just dreams," said the crow. "They've come to gather the thoughts of the royal personages for the hunt. All the better, because now you can observe them in bed. But if you win honor and nobility, I expect you to show a grateful heart." "That's no way to talk," said the crow from the forest. Then they entered the first hall. Its walls were adorned with rose-colored satin and artificial flowers. Here the dreams had already rushed past them, but they moved so fast that Gerda had no chance to see the royal personages. One hall was more magnificent than the other. Oh yes, it could be quite intimidating. And then they were in the bedchamber. The ceiling looked like an enormous palm tree with fronds of glass, precious glass. In the center of the room, hanging from a thick stalk of gold, were 2 beds, each of which looked like a lily. One that was white, and in it lay the princess. The other was red, and that was the one which Gerda was to look for little Kai. She bent back one of the red leaves, and then she saw the nape of a brown neck. Oh, it was Kai! She called his name quite loudly over a lamp over him. The dreams came rushing back on horseback, returning to the room. He awoke, turned his head. It was not little Kai. The prince only looked like Kai from the back of his neck, but young and handsome he certainly was, and from the white lily bed the princess peeked out and asked what was going on. Then little Gerda began to weep and told them the whole story and about everything the crows had done for her. "You poor little thing," said the prince and princess, and they praised the crows and said that they weren't the least bit angry with them, although they should never do it again. This time, however, they would be given a reward. "Do you want to fly away free?" asked the princess. "Or would you like a permanent position as the court crows, and be welcome to all the scraps in the kitchen?" And both crows curtsied and asked for a permanent position because they were thinking of their old age and said, "It would be good to have something for our golden years," as they put it. And the prince climbed out of his bed to let Gerda sleep in it, because that was the least he could do. She folded her little hands and thought, "How good people and animals are." Then she closed her eyes and slept blissfully. All the dreams came flying back, and this time they looked like God's angels. They were pulling a little sled, and on it sat Kai, nodding. But it was only a dream, and that's why it vanished as soon as she awoke. The next day she was dressed from head to toe in silk and velvet. She was invited to stay at the palace and lived comfortably, but she wanted only a little carriage with a horse and a pair of little boots. Then she would be off again, in the wide world, to look for Kai. And then she was given both boots and a muff. She was dressed exquisitely, and when she was ready to leave, a new carriage made of pure gold was waiting at the door. It bore a coat of arms of the prince and princess, shining like a star. The coachmen, footmen, and postilions, there were postilions too, wore gold crowns. The prince and princess helped her into the carriage and wished her the best of luck. The forest crow, who was now married, accompanied her for the first 15 miles. He sat beside her because he couldn't bear to ride backward. The other crow stood at the gate and flapped her wings. She wasn't coming along because she had been suffering from headaches ever since she had been given a permanent position and had too much to eat. The inside of the coach was lined with sugar pastries, and on the seat were fruits and ginger snaps. "Farewell, farewell," called the prince and princess, and little Gerda wept, and the crow wept. That's how the first mile passed. Then the crow also bid her farewell, and that was the saddest leave-taking of all. He flew up to a tree, flapped his black wings as long as he could see the carriage, which gleamed like the bright sun. The fifth story, The Little Robber Girl. They drove through the dark forest, but the coach shone like a torch, as it dazzled the eyes of robbers, and that was something they couldn't abide. "It's gold! It's gold!" they shouted as they rushed forward, seized hold of the horses, killed the little postilions, the coachman, and the footman, and then yanked little Gerda out of the carriage. "She's plump! She's charming! She's been fattened on nut meats!" as the old robber hag, who had long bristly beard and eyebrows that hung down into her eyes. "She's as nice and fat as a little lamb. How delicious she's going to taste." And then she pulled out her gleaming knife, which shone so brightly that it was terrifying. "Ow!" said the hag all at once. She'd been bitten on the ear by her own little daughter, who was hanging on her back and was so wild and naughty that it was sheer delight. "You odious child!" said the mother, and then she didn't have time to slaughter Gerda. "I want her to play with me," said the little robber girl. "She has to give me her muff and her beautiful dress and sleep with me in my bed." Then she bit her mother again. So the robber hag leaped into the air and spun around at all the robbers and laughed and said, "Look how she's dancing with her brat." "I want to ride in the carriage," said the little robber girl, and she insisted on having her way because she was so spoiled and stubborn. She and Gerda got into the carriage, and then they drove over stumps and thickets deeper into the forest. The little robber girl was as big as Gerda, but stronger, with wide shoulders. Her eyes were quite dark, and they looked almost sad. She put her arm around little Gerda's waist and said, "I won't let them slaughter you, as long as you don't make me angry. You're a princess, aren't you?" "No," said little Gerda, and told her all about what she had been through and how much she loved little Kai. The robber girl gave her a somber look, and nodded her head slightly. She said, "I won't let them slaughter you, even if you do make me angry. I'll do it myself." And then she dried Gerda's eyes and tucked both of her hands into the beautiful muff, which was so soft and warm. Then the carriage came to a halt. They were in the middle of the courtyard of the robber's castle. It was cracked from top to bottom. Ravens and crows were flying out of the open crevices, and huge bulldogs, each of which looked like it could swallow a person whole, were leaping into the high air. But they didn't bark, because it was forbidden. Inside the vast, ancient, soot-filled hall, a great fire was blazing in the middle of the stone floor. Smoke drifted along the ceiling, trying to find its way out. Soup was cooking in a big copper kettle, and hares and rabbits were turning on spits. "Tonight you'll sleep here with me and all my little animals," said the robber girl. They ate and drank and then went over to a corner where hay and blankets had been spread out. Overhead on laths and beams sat almost 100 doves that all seemed to be asleep, though they stirred a bit when the little girls approached. "They're all mine," said the little robber girl as she grabbed the nearest one and held it by its legs and shook it so it flapped its wings. "Kiss it," she cried, and fluttered it in Gerda's face. "There, sit with my wood rascals," she went on, pointing to a hole high up on the wall that had several bars fastened over it. "They're wood rascals, those two doves. They'd fly up an instant they were kept properly locked up. And here's my old sweetheart, Bay!" She tugged on the antler of a reindeer who was tethered with a copper ring around its neck. "We have to keep him penned up too, or he'd run away. Every single evening I tickle him on the neck with my sharp knife. He's so scared of it." And the little girl pulled a long knife out of a crack in the wall and let it slide along the reindeer's throat. The poor animal kicked his legs, and the robber girl laughed. Then she pulled Gerda along to bed. "Do you take your knife to bed with you?" asked Gerda, giving it a rather frightened look. "I always sleep with a knife," said the little robber girl. "You never know what might come along. But tell me again what you told me before about little Kai, and why you've gone out into the wide world." And Gerda told her everything from the beginning, and the wood doves cooed up above in their cage while the other doves slept. The little robber girl put one arm around Gerda's neck and held a knife in her other hand, and slept so noisily that you could clearly hear her. But Gerda couldn't sleep a wink. She didn't know whether she was going to live or die. The robbers sat around the fire, singing and drinking, and the robber hag was turning somersaults. Oh, that was an awful sight for the little girl. Then the wood dove said, "Coo, coo, we've seen little Kai. A white man was carrying a sled. He was sitting in the Snow Queen's carriage, which raced low over the forest when we lay our nests. She blew in all the fledglings, and they all died except for the two of us. Coo, coo." "What's that you're saying up there?" called Gerda. "Where did the Snow Queen go? Do you know anything about it?" "She must have gone to Lapland, where there's always snow and ice. Just ask the reindeer who's tethered to the rope." "There's ice and snow, and it's so blissful and grand," said the reindeer. "There you can be bound freely through the great sparkling valleys. That's where the Snow Queen has her summer tent. But her permanent castle is up near the North Pole, on the island called Spitzbergen." "Oh, Kai, little Kai," said Gerda. "You better lay still now," said the robber girl, "or I stick a knife in your belly." In the morning, Gerda told her everything that the wood doves had said. The little robber girl gave her a somber look, but nodded her head and said, "Never mind, never mind." "Do you know where Lapland is?" she asked the reindeer. "Who would know better than I?" said the animal, and his eyes sparkled. "That's where I was born and raised. That's where I bounded through the snowfield." "Listen to me," the little girl said to Gerda. "You can see that all our menfolk are gone, but Mother's still here, and she's going to stay. But later in the morning she'll take a drink from that big bottle, then give herself a little nap. That's when I'm going to do something for you." And she jumped out of bed, threw her arms around her mother's neck, tugging on her beard, and said, "My own sweet goat, good morning." And her mother pinched her nose until it turned red and blue, but it was all done with affection. When her mother had taken a drink from her bottle and lain down for a little nap, the robber girl went over to the reindeer and said, "I have a great urge to tickle you many more times with my sharp knife because you're so amusing when I do that. But never mind. I'm going to untie your rope and help you outside so you can run off to Lapland. But you must be quick about it and take the little girl to the Snow Queen's castle where her playmate is. I'm sure you've heard her story. She talked loud enough and you're always eavesdropping." The reindeer leaped for joy. The robber girl picked up little Gerda and took the precaution of tying her on. She even gave her a little cushion to sit on. "Never mind," she said. "Here are your fur boots because it will be cold. I'm keeping the muff. It's much too charming, but you're not going to freeze. Here are my mother's big knitted mittens. They'll reach all the way up to your elbows. Stick your hands in. Now your hands look just like my hideous mother's." And Gerda wept with joy. "I don't like your sniveling," said the little robber girl. "Try and look pleased. And here are 2 loaves of bread and a ham so you won't starve." Everything was tied to the reindeer's back. The little robber girl opened the door and lured all the big dogs inside. Then she sliced through the rope with her knife and said to the reindeer, "Run! But take good care of this little girl." And Gerda stretched out her hands in the big knitted mittens toward the robber girl to bid her farewell. Then the reindeer flew over the thickets and stumps through the great forest, over marshes and steppes as fast as he could go. The wolves howled and ravens shrieked. "Crackle, crackle," said the sky. It looked as if it had a nosebleed. "There are my northern lights," said the reindeer. "Look how they shine!" And then he kept on running. Night and day, the loaves of bread were eaten, the ham was too. And then they were in Lapland. The 6th story, The Lap Woman and the Finn Woman. They stopped at a little house. It was a pitiful hovel. The roof reached all the way to the ground, and the door was so low that the family had to crawl on their bellies to go in or out. No one was home except an old Lap woman who was frying fish over a whale oil lamp. And the reindeer told her Gerda's whole story. But first he told his own, because he thought it was much more important, and Gerda was so worn out from the cold that she couldn't even speak. "Oh, you poor things," said the Lap woman. "And you still have a long way to go. You have to travel thousands of miles through Finnmark because that's where the Snow Queen lives, out in the country, burning blue lights every single evening. I'm going to write a few words on a dried cod because I have no paper, and then I'll give it to you to take along to the Finn woman up there. She can give you better directions than I can." After Gerda had warmed up and was given something to eat and drink, the Lap woman wrote a few words on a dried cod, told Gerda to take good care of it, tied her firmly to the reindeer again, and off he went. Crackle, crackle, it said up in the sky. All night, the long, loveliest northern lights blazed. And then they arrived in Finnmark and knocked on the Finn woman's chimney because she had no door. It was so hot inside that even the Finn woman walked around almost naked. She was short and quite grimy looking. She unbuttoned little Gerda's clothes at once and pulled off her knitted mittens and boots because otherwise she would have been too hot. She put a piece of ice on top of the reindeer's head and then read what was written on the dried cod. She read it 3 times until she knew it by heart, and then put the fish into her cooking pot since it was edible after all. And then she never wasted anything. The reindeer told first his own story and then little Gerda's, and the Finn woman blinked her wise eyes, but didn't say a word. "You're so clever," said the reindeer. I know that you can tie up all the winds of the earth with a thread. When the skipper loosens one knot, he has good wind. If he loosens another, a sharp wind blows, and if he loosens a third and a fourth, then a storm rages so fiercely that forests topple. Won't you give this little girl a potion to lend her strength of 12 men so she can vanquish the Snow Queen? Vanquish the Snow Queen? That wasn't in the agreement. No one talked about that. The strength of 12 men, said the Finn woman. Yes, that should be enough. And she went over to a shelf, took down a big roll of pie and spread it out. Strange-looking letters were printed on it, and the Finn woman began reading so intently that sweat poured down her forehead. But the reindeer again pleaded earnestly for little Gerda, and Gerda, her eyes full of tears, gave the Finn woman such an imploring look that the woman began blinking once more, and drew the reindeer over to a corner to whisper to him as she put fresh ice on his head. It's true that little Kai is with the Snow Queen. He thinks everything there is to his taste and to his liking, and he believes that it's the best place in the world. But that's because he has a splinter of glass in his heart and a tiny speck of glass in his eye. They have to be taken out, or else he'll never be a human being, and the Snow Queen will keep her hold over him. But can't you give little Gerda a potion to drink so she will gain power over all that? I can't give her any greater power than she already has. Don't you see how great it is? Don't you see how people and animals want to serve her? How she's come so far in the world on her bare feet? She must learn of her power from us. It resides in her heart. It lies in the fact that she is a sweet and innocent child. If she can't reach the Snow Queen on her own and remove the glass from little Kai, there's nothing we can do to help her. 10 miles from here is the edge of the Snow Queen's garden. You can carry the little girl that far. Set her down near the big bush with the red berries in the snow. Don't chitter-chatter for long, and hurry back here. Then the Finn woman lifted little Gerda on the reindeer's back, who set off as fast as he could. Oh, I forgot my boots! I forgot my mittens! Cried little Gerda. She could feel the sting of the cold, but the reindeer didn't dare stop. He ran until he came to a big bush with red berries. That's where he set Gerda down, kissed her on the lips, and big, shiny tears ran down the animal's cheeks. Then he ran back as fast as he could. There stood poor Gerda, with no shoes, with no gloves, in the middle of the terrible, ice-cold She set off as fast as she could. Then a whole regiment of snowflakes appeared, but they didn't fall from the sky, which was quite clear and glowing in the northern lights. The snowflakes were running along the ground, and the closer they came, the bigger they grew. Gerda remembered how big and awful they had seemed when she looked at the snowflakes through the magnifying glass. But this time, they were truly enormous and terrifying. They were alive. They were the Snow Queen's advance troops. They had the strangest shapes. Some looked like big horrid porcupines, others looked like giant knots of snakes with writhing heads, and still others looked like fat little bears with their fur sticking out all over. All of them were dazzling white. All of them were living snowflakes. Then little Gerda said the Lord's Prayer, and the cold was so great that she could see her own breath. It came out of her mouth like a cloud of smoke. Her breath got thicker and thicker, forming into bright little angels that grew bigger and bigger as they touched the ground. All of them wore helmets on their heads and carried spears and shields in their hands. There were more and more of them, and by the time little Gerda had finished saying the Lord's Prayer, there was an entire legion around her. They thrust their spears at the fearsome snowflakes, which shattered to 100 pieces, and little Gerda continued on, quite safe and undaunted. The angels patted her feet and hands, and then she didn't feel the cold as much. She walked briskly towards the Snow Queen's castle. But first, we must see how little Kai is doing. It's true that he wasn't thinking about little Gerda, and least of all that she might be standing outside the castle. This is the 7th and final story. What happened at the Snow Queen's castle, and what happened afterward? The castle walls were made of drifting snow, and the windows and doors of razor-sharp winds. There were over 100 halls, and all of them shaped by drifting snow. Never was there any merriment, not so much as a little bear dance when a gale blew in and the polar bears would walk on their hind legs to show off their elegant manners. Empty, vast, and cold were the halls of the Snow Queen. The northern lights flared so precisely that it was possible to count when they would be at their height and when they were at their lowest. In the middle of the endless empty snow hall was a frozen lake. It was cracked into 1,000 pieces, but each piece was exactly like all the others, and that was quite a feat. In the center sat the Snow Queen. Whenever she was home, and then she would say that she was sitting on the mirror of reason, that it was kind of the best thing in the world. Little Kai was quite blue with cold. In fact, he was almost black. Yet he didn't notice because she had kissed the shivers out of him and his heart was practically a lump of ice. He was dragging around several sharp, flat pieces of ice which he placed in every imaginable way, trying to make a pattern out of them. It was just like when the rest of us take little wooden tiles and put them together to make shapes. Kai was almost making shapes, the most ingenious of all. It was the ice game of reason. To his eyes, the shapes were quite splendid and of the utmost importance. That was the work of the little speck of glass in his eye. He created whole shapes that formed words, but he never could figure out how to form one, the one word he was looking for, the word eternity. And then the Snow Queen had said, "If you can create a shape for me, then you will be your own master, and I will give you the whole world a new pair of skates." But he couldn't do it. "Now I've got to dash off to the warm countries," said the Snow Queen. "I want to go out and peer into the black cauldrons." She meant the fire spurting out of mountains of Etna and Vesuvius, as they're called. "I need to whitewash them a bit. It's only proper. It would look so good on top of all those lemons and grapes." And then the Snow Queen flew off, and Kai was left all alone in the vast empty ice hall that went on for miles. He looked at the pieces of ice and thought so hard. His mind groaned. So stiff and still he did sit that you almost think that he would have frozen to death. That's when little Gerda entered the castle through the huge portal which was made of razor-sharp winds. But she had an evening prayer, and the winds died down as if they wanted to sleep, and she stepped inside the vast, empty, cold halls, and then she saw Kai, so blue, and so cold. She recognized him. She threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight and crying, "Kai! Kai, sweet little Kai, I found you at last!" But he sat there quite motionless, stiff and cold. Then little Gerda wept hot tears. They fell on his breast. They seeped into his heart. They thawed out the lump of ice and dissolved the little shard of mirror inside. He looked at her, and he sang a hymn. "In the valley where the roses grow wild, there we will speak to the Christ child." Then Kai burst into tears. He wept so hard that speck of mirror rolled out of his eye. He recognized her and rejoiced. "Gerda! Sweet little Gerda, where have you been this entire time? And where have I been?" He looked all around. "How cold it is here! How empty and vast it is here!" He hugged Gerda tight, and she laughed and cried with joy. It was so blissful that even the pieces of ice began to dance around them with joy. When the pieces grew tired and laid down to rest, they were lying precisely in the shape of the letters the Snow Queen had told Kai to create, so that he would be his own master and she would give them the whole world in a new pair of skates. Gerda kissed his cheeks and they bloomed. She kissed his eyes and they shone like her own. She kissed his hands and feet and he grew strong and healthy. The Snow Queen was welcome to come home. His release lay spelled out before them in the glittering pieces of ice. And they took each other by the hand and wandered out of the enormous castle. They talked about grandmother and the roses up on the roof, and wherever they went the winds lay perfectly still and the sun shone through. When they reached the bush with the red berries, the reindeer stood there waiting. He had brought another young reindeer whose udder was full, and she gave the children her warm milk and kissed them on the lips. Then they carried Kai and Gerda first to the Finn woman's house, where they warmed themselves in the hot room and received directions from their homeward journey, then on to the Lapp woman. who had sewn clothes for them and made ready her sleigh. And the reindeer and his young companion ran alongside and accompanied them to the very border of the country, where the first green sprouts were peeking out. That's where they bid farewell to the reindeer and the Lapwoman. "Farewell," they all said, and the first little birds began to chirp. The forest had green buds, and out of the woods, riding a magnificent horse that Gerda recognized, it had been harnessed to the golden carriage, came a young girl with a shimmering red cape on her head and pistols in front. It was the little robber girl who had grown tired of staying home, and she was now on her way north, though later, if it didn't please her, she might head for other parts. She recognized Gerda at once. Gerda recognized her, and they both rejoiced. "You're a strange fellow the way you tramp around," she said to little Kai. "I wonder if you really deserve to have someone running around the ends of the earth for your sake." But Gerda patted her on the cheek and asked about the prince and the princess. "They've gone off to foreign lands," said the robber girl. "And what about the crow?" asked little Gerda. "Oh, the crow is dead," she replied. "His tame sweetheart is a widow now and walks around with a scrap of black woolen yarn on her leg. She moans so pitifully. It's all nonsense. But tell me of how things have gone for you. How have you managed to find him?" So Kai and Gerda both told her the story. "Well, snip, snap, snurra, basalura," said the robber girl, and she took them both by the hand and promised that if she ever passed through their city, she would come to visit them. Then she rode off into the wide world. But Kai and Gerda walked hand in hand, and as they walked, a lovely spring arrived with flowers and greenery. The church bells chimed, and they recognized the tall flowers in the big city. This was where they lived. They walked around the city and over to grandmother's door, up the stairs, into the room where everything stood exactly as it had before. And the clock went tick-tick, and its hands were moving. But as they stepped through the door, they noticed that they had grown up. The roses on the eaves of the roof were blossoming in the open windows, and there stood their childhood stools. Kai and Gerda sat down on them and held each other's hands. They had forgotten all about the cold, empty splendor of the Snow Queen's castle, as if it had been a bad dream. Grandmother was sitting in God's bright sunshine and reading aloud from the Bible. "Unless you've become as little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." And Kai and Gerda looked into each other's eyes, and all of a sudden they understood the old hymn. "In the valley where the roses go wild, there we will speak to the Christ child." There they sat, two grown-ups, and yet they were children at heart, and it was summer, warm, blissful summer. And those were the tales of the Snow Queen, Part 2. I hope you guys enjoyed that, because it was incredibly beautiful to see such a strong friendship and such a strong little girl going to see her friend, going to save her friend. And that's the kind of strength that we need. We need to have the strength to help our friends and really stand up for them and go chase them no matter what. No matter if there is a speck of a mirror in their eye or a shard of glass in their heart. We fight for them because we love them. And the world is an understanding and a beautiful place, and each of us is important, and we make our voices heard and we make our stories known. Because that's the power of stories. It really does bring people together. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'm excited to see you again next week, because I have a very, 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 very special thing planned for next week. So, thank you. And I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and safe.